Okay. So hi everybody. Thank you for joining this session this sunny Wednesday lunchtime. I'm Rachel Roby from Cogent Skills. I'll do a brief introduction and then we will start the session. So thank you for joining. This is a session on skills policy briefing. This is something that we regularly do when there is big policy news about, and as we have had an election before the summer break, we thought it was a timely intervention to share with you what we're currently in the know, what we're learning about some changes that might come through. And this is alongside the annual webinar that I put on in August or September each year, which goes through the funding rules for apprenticeship changes. So I'm going to split the session in two halves. The first half will be on the skills, on the policy briefing, and then we'll move on to the key bits of information that I annually share with employers around changes that have come into the apprenticeship funding rules. So I hope everybody is on the right call. So I will make a start. So for those that don't know who Cogent Skills are, we are a sector skills council, one of the original sector skills councils that was set up. We are a charity that supports employers and stakeholders within science and technology sectors. We have a number of businesses within our Cogent family, which include an apprenticeship delivery department, and we also support with graduate and sandwich course placements. We have an endpoint assessment organisation and newly regulated awarding organisation called SIAS. We have our membership organisations which cover the life science and nuclear sectors, and we also have a long-standing courses and consultancy business unit. I'm Rachel Roby and sit within our membership and strategy business unit. I am the technical education and standards lead. I support on all things technical education. My background is very much apprenticeships, from doing my own to managing apprenticeship provision and then running a employer provider. And I've been with Cogent for over 3 years now, and one of my roles is to support employers with updating apprenticeship standards, but also supporting employers with all things technical education and understanding all of the key policy drivers that government are introducing, and basically helping you understand what they mean and cutting out some of the bump and giving you the need to know on certain things around technical education. So that, as I explained, I'm going to split the session into two halves. The first half is going to be on a policy update, and then part two, we will look at the new set of funding rules that have recently come in and what impact those changes might have for you. So to start with the political overview, we now have a new government. I'm sure you're all aware. So Labour came into power after the 2024 July election. They came in on a very much mission-led government, with one of their key missions being around breaking down barriers to opportunity at every stage. The Labour Party had introduced the 5 missions for about 18 months before the election, so we did get a bit of understanding around what the missions were about. Policy papers were introduced, interviews were done, but through the manifesto we were able to identify some key areas that Labour wanted to concentrate on if they were to come into power. And through the manifesto, we were able to identify a number of skills related commitments that they wanted to move through if they did come into power. Now they're in power, so now it is our opportunity to hold them to account in terms of their manifesto, and to also pay close attention to some key objectives that they laid out within their manifesto, and some things that they're already talking about or already doing straight away, which is good to see. So I'm not going to read out the slide in full, but there's some areas that we have highlighted. Key priorities that they want to do is they want to do a comprehensive strategy of post-16 education, which we all look forward to seeing, and what will be involved in that. They want to and are establishing Skills England, which will be a new body that will support the mission of developing and having a highly trained workforce. They want to transform colleges into specialist technical excellence colleges. We don't know an awful lot more about that at the moment. but it's something that we look forward to hearing about more, and how we can get involved as a sector to influence what those technical colleges might look like. Long standing question that we've all had is what would happen with the apprenticeship levy. They talked for a long time about reforming the levy and to transform that into a growth and skills levy, which I'll touch on in more detail later on. They also want to introduce sector workforce training plans, and this is backed with new enforced plans of industrial strategies. They want to look at and improve careers advice in schools and colleges. And ultimately, one of their goals is to bring together the Job Centre and the National Careers Service and merge them into one body. So these were some key things that we picked out as generic skills. There are other elements of the manifesto that obviously relate to transitioning industries, life science specific, but from a skills perspective, these are the things that we're really trying to understand and get to understand some more detail about. Just to introduce, I'm sure a lot of you know who these people are, but it's just a bit of an overview of who key ministers are. So these are ministers that are either secretaries of state. So we've got the Secretary of State, Ed Miliband, for energy, security and net zero. We've got our new Secretary of State for Education, Bridget Phillipson, Science, Innovation and Technology, Secretary of State, Peter Kyle, and then a couple of the ministers, and then Jonathan Reynolds, who is Secretary of State for Business and Trade, as well as some key ministerial appointments that have been made. So particular focus for me in the role that I do is Jackie Smith, who is now Minister of State for Skills, and she is in the House of Lords, and Sir Patrick Vallance, who has been made Minister of State for Science. So these are key appointments that we obviously keep a track of what they're saying when they do media, when they do press releases, and key messages that are coming out of different government departments is part of my role to keep an eye on what they're saying and what they are introducing. When a new government, when Parliament reopened, it reopened with a King's Speech. This was the first King's Speech of the new government, and King's Speeches are a way to demonstrate and show what a government's agendas are for the first kind of 12 to 18 months. So it was a kind of record-breaking King's Speech back in July with 40 bills being introduced. We haven't included them all, but you will see that there are some key ones that we have identified that are relatable to the sectors and the industries that we work with. And especially for me, paying close attention to the Education Standards Bill around raising standards across education. And one thing that they've already instructed is a curriculum and assessment review across all stages of curriculum, so from 5 years old up to 18 years old. And we will hope to hear more news about how that will be conducted in due course, and would welcome, if there are public consultations, any support that our employers can provide that we can feed in. Skills England was in the first King's Speech, which was good because it shows that they are pushing forward with plans, and I'll touch on that in a little bit more detail in a minute. And the apprenticeship levy reform. So we got a really good understanding straight away within 2 weeks of the government being formed, their key agendas for the first Parliament, and 3 really important moves that we have been waiting to see, the priorities, and it was really pleasing to see. And what was equally pleasing to see was over 2023, and lots of you on the call were involved in discussions that we had, we put together our own manifesto where Cogent made recommendations on behalf of the sectors that we work with and the companies that we work with of what we wanted the skills system to look like. And what we've been able to do is obviously, and what I will continue to do, and we will internally, is track the progress that's being made. Obviously, we want to ensure that we're supporting where we can with the government, but also holding them to account on some of the commitments and some of the things, lots of them that we've talked about for years, and people that have been on similar calls with me or work with us on other projects will know the type of things that we've fed back in the past. Levy reform, qualifications and apprenticeships, safeguarding funding, making sure there's sufficient careers advice, and making sure that there's opportunity opportunities for all. So it's really important that we can track what the government is saying, what they're doing, and making sure that we take you as employers on that journey with us. So it was really nice, and I've just a little kind of arrows of where we can see very beginning stages, but we can see some initial agenda ideas that the government have, which align with some of the recommendations and some of the priority areas that we've highlighted. So not to go into too much detail, but we've long talked about sector deals and sector specific strategies, which has been really nice to see around the industrial strategy approach, apprenticeship levy and what will happen with that. Protecting funding. So we've long called out for BTECs, which are very popular qualifications, to not be defunded. So we were really pleased to hear that there is a temporary halt on the defunding of BTECs, and this is specifically important to the science BTEC, but also the engineering and manufacturing BTECs that are really popular courses of study for post-16, that we have long had concerns about them being dropped for T-levels that are very new to the market. So we're really pleased that that has been halted, albeit temporarily, but we will wait to see what comes out of the recommendations. We're also really pleased around education and careers that there is a drive to improve quality. We await the increasing investment, but the things that we're hearing are positive in terms of reviewing curriculum, trying to use AI and other technology to support teaching staff, but also keeping the curriculum as up to date as it possibly can. Careers advice, again, it was in the manifesto. It's a commitment that they've had to look at how careers guidance can be improved, as well as that overarching curriculum update and keeping it ready, fit for purpose and fit for the future. So again, early signs, but positive that we can see. But it also shows that they've got some way to go, because there's lots of areas where there haven't been arrows put against. I will continue to track this, and we hope over time that there'll be more initiatives where I'll be able to see that they are mapping across to the recommendations that we made with our skills manifesto. So in terms of the specifics of what we know, again, I'm going to talk you through a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what we do know is currently happening. So just before summer recess, the Prime Minister and Secretary of State for Education announced the launch of Skills England, and there's a picture here of Richard Pennycook. He has been a long-standing non-exec director at the Department of Education, and he has been appointed the interim chair of Skills England, whilst a full board chair and CEO are being recruited. And just so that you're aware, there are currently job adverts out for board members, chair roles of the new Skills England. Pennycook has a long-standing relationship with the Department of Education, as well as a long-standing and experienced history in business. And there's just a few of his previous businesses that he currently is supporting. And the overarching kind of definition or objective of Skills England is bringing together the fractured skills landscape and create a shared national ambition to boost the nation's skills. Now, what that means as of now, that is to be coming out in due course. But one thing that they did announce straight away was that the functions of IFATE, so the Institute of Apprenticeships and Technical Education, would be those functions would be transferred straight into Skills England, and that would take place over the first 9 to 12 months. So from now onwards, there will be that transfer of functions. We await the release of the bill from the King's Speech. We don't know what the wording of that will be yet. Richard Pennycook has done one recorded live webinar earlier on in the summer, and he has another one planned towards the end of next week. So it's really good from our point of view that there's transparency and there is close updates on what is happening with those transitions and with Skills England's priorities. And obviously, as part of my role, I can keep you informed with what we hear. What we do know, so from the session that he did in the summer, we know that They have three main priorities as of August 2024. Now, I can imagine these moving at quite a pace. But what they want to look at is a single picture of what the national and the local skills needs look like and require over the next decade. Now, I would hope that they would use the local skills improvement plans, rich data that has been pulled over years, either from the likes of Cogent Skills and our other sector skills councils, or the Unit for Future Skills, who have done big pieces of work to be able to show what the skills are and what the skills of the future will be. Develop a highly responsive training system, that will be part of Skills England and will showcase and be that authoritative power on what this new growth and skills levy could look like and how that could be used. And then the third area of urgency is around making sure that national and regional skills systems work together. And this is something that we've long talked about, that it's all well and good having pockets of really good practice, but how can we make sure that that is replicated nationally, and make sure that no region is left behind, especially where there are similar industries working together. So it's really good to see that one of their priorities is around making sure that it is national. What we'd obviously always like to see as well is UK wide. Obviously, it's called Skills England, and that is because funding and education decisions are devolved. But we do, and we have always called for, where there can be more integration with Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, that there is opportunity to explore. Example of that is being able to use apprenticeship standards, or being able to transfer levy to be able to use, as we know that this is an area and a bit of a bone of contention for some companies that have sites across the devolved nations, but they want to be able to offer the same apprenticeship opportunities that they can to their English sites. And this is a conversation that we have on an ongoing basis when we're asked where changes to the system need to be made. Another thing that I mentioned earlier on in the session, and this has come out of the manifesto, which is good, is that they will bring forward the strategy for post-16 with elements around kind of making sure that curriculum is up to date, it's responsive, it can be flexible and agile, to make sure that it's fit for future. And it can also be responsive to where there are skills demands or there are changing circumstances in areas. So whether that's a reskill, upskill, cross-skill for people that might need to move roles, might be introducing new technologies, might be introducing new ways of working. And this will also be linked to what I mentioned earlier around these industrial strategies for key growth areas. So it's really good to see. As I said, just before summer recess, they did announce the level 2 and 3, the level 3 funding halt for defunding BTEC, so BTECs can continue to be used. And they also advised the chair of the group that are going to look at this full curriculum review. They have said that in the autumn they would release more information, and hopefully that would start with the consultation process. So we will await what comes out in terms of next steps for that, and we'll keep you informed if there is an opportunity to get involved with any consultations. So that's what we know around Skills England. And then when we're talking about the Skills and Growth Levy, so again, I've taken a bit of a snippet from the manifesto around the broken, in inverted commas, apprenticeship levy, talking about how rigid the rules are and the plans and hopes to create a flexible growth and skills levy, with Skills England being that consultative body to make sure that any courses that will be able to be used with the levy show value for money. What I would say is Labour over the previous years, and this was something that was publicly spoken about and disputed between ministerial teams, was that originally there was a 50-50 split being discussed. So 50% of the levy would be ring fenced for apprenticeships and 50% would be able to be used. What I will say is that 50-50 figure has been dropped. It didn't appear in the manifesto and it hasn't really come back since. So we're not sure what those figures are going to be and what that pot of flexibility will look like. There were some previous announcements back in April by when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister around increasing the levy transfer pot up to 25%. Labour haven't rescinded that announcement, and that is now, live and can be used. But there hasn't been any discussions on what the amount will be. We haven't yet had the timeline for when anything will come through for the growth and skills levy, but as you can imagine, there is lots of Chinese whispers. There is lots of discussions happening in various different forums that we talk in, that we meet in, around what people are hearing about the growth and skills levy. Now that can wildly change from, it could be a 5%, it could be 50%, it'll be these courses, it'll be this course and nothing else. So at the moment, what I have said internally is until we know more, I don't want to come out to you and give you information that might be incorrect, or it might not actually end up being published policy. But of course, what I can say is that we will keep our ears to the ground and we will keep you updated when we do start to know more. Whether there'll be a consultation or whether there'll just be a policy announcement, we might hear a little bit more when it comes to the budget, and we might start to get a little bit more indication around what the plans are. But of course, until there is a policy out, we're not sure what there'll be, what any flexibilities, and it will be available. I've just posed some questions. Obviously, this is a delivered webinar. There isn't an awful lot of time for Q&A, but if anybody has any thoughts that they would like to us to consider, we are obviously gathering views from our industries to be able to have position statements, position papers, or when we are engaging with government departments, that we can give your views back. So if anybody does have any thoughts on things you would like to see from Skills England, what you would like to see from the Growth and Skills Levy, and any impact, positive or negative, that you have any views on, please put any comments in the chat that I can have a look through afterwards. And all this kind of helps us understand where you are as employers into what changes might be coming, and be able to think about how we can position and how we can preempt any future decisions that are made, and how we can help you understand the impacts of what might come in the future. So I'm going to pause there for a second. So that is the end of the policy update in terms of what we know from the new government. In terms of a timeline, Parliament actually goes into recess tomorrow for party conference season. Internally, we monitor what happens in party conferences. It'll be interesting to know what comes out of any discussions or debates, especially at the moment, more importantly, the Labour conference, in terms of whether we do hear any more news that comes out. But equally, at the Conservative conference, the Lib Dems, the Greens had theirs at the weekend. We will keep a track of what the key discussions that are coming out of it when it comes to skills, now that the other parties are seeing what the manifesto being brought to life, any key priorities from the King's speech, but also any positions that other parties are making, which will then, when Parliament comes back, and hopefully we'll have more timescales of when these bills will be introduced, we will get a sense of what the other parties, hopefully as well as the Labour Party, will be introducing as time moves on. I will say it's probably going to be quite frantic over the next 12 months. We're all braced internally for potentially quite a lot of change. Might not be substantial changes, but obviously transferring powers from the Institute to Skills England and understanding what that means. So I know that there's people on the call that have been involved in Trailblazer development, so apprenticeship standards development. So what does that mean? The new standards that we have designed. I have been reassured by IFATE colleagues that absolutely nothing is changing in terms of who we deal with, the process that we go through, and the work for the standards, so including the engineering maintenance technician, which will be the new MOE or science industry maintenance technician. All of that work is still to be planned, to be fully seen through, and we won't see an impact on any changes of that. What happens once Skills England is fully operational? We don't know what will happen and what certain roles or functions will be. But obviously we do have good connections into government departments and the relationships that we've built as trailblazers with the Institute. So I would hope that we're on their mailing list for any updates that do come through, and we can be a source of support for you as employers that might have a bit of uncertainty around who to speak to about certain issues. And if anybody ever wants to reach out, you hopefully have all got my mobile number, or you've got my email address that you can drop me a note. Okay, I'm going to move on to the apprenticeship funding rules. So every year, the ESFA, the Education and Skills Funding Agency, release a new set of apprenticeship rules that are applicable for those that have live apprentices or new apprentices in the academic year. This is an annual occurrence. Over the last few years, we have seen a reduction in red tape, I would call it, and an ongoing commitment to ease the burden of the funding rules. For anybody that has downloaded them, printed them out, put them on tablets, they are meaty documents. Anybody wants any bedtime reading, but over the years, what they've tried to do is streamline them. So there used to be 3 separate documents. 2 years ago, they brought them into one document, and they have committed to doing that each year now to be able to help all parties read them. So they've gone through a commitment of bringing them out earlier. So we have had scenarios in the past where the funding rules have only come out a week or so before the new academic year, which, as you can imagine, can be a bit of a nightmare for providers that might have to be scrambling around changing documents or changing the ways of working with very little notice. So we do now get a draft set in the spring, and then the final set, version 1, has been released in May for the last couple of years, which is really good. It gives everybody time to understand them. It gives training providers plenty of notice before the start of the academic year in August to, if they do have to change documentation, introduce new screening processes, etc. It should give them time to be able to do all of those, so that learners that are enrolling in the new academic year have a smoother process and they're compliant from day one. ESFA have released a number of changes this year. I wouldn't say it's a massive year for change, which I think is quite welcomed, because over the last few years there has been quite a lot of change, but they have set out some key flexibilities and some key guidance. And what's also good is they've taken feedback on board that some of their rules in the past have been a little bit ambiguous. So they have tried to clarify the language and tightened up the language so that there isn't any kind of wiggle room. They will always find ways that to have wiggle room, but they have tried to make sure that the clarifications are clearer. Some of the rules, and I'll try and flag this as I go through the update, are valid for any apprentices, and some will only be available for the apprentices that start from the 1st of August. And I have tried to include where that is appropriate. What I would say is I can give you these updates. You can have access to read the documents yourself if you want to read them in detail, but also your key account managers and your training providers, obviously they're the ones that have to invoke the rules, and they have to work towards the funding rules to be compliant as an apprenticeship provider. So if you do have any questions or queries, by all means come to me, but also please feel free and make sure that you are engaging with your training providers. If you're not convinced that a rule is being followed, please make sure you raise it to your training providers. Admittedly, you only know what you know, and hopefully this session will help with those, but it is really important that you stay engaged and you work with your training providers to make sure that, one, the funding rules are being met, but more importantly, your learners are progressing in the way that has been planned and the way that is being funded. So I'm going to start going through the summary. For anybody that has attended these sessions in the past, I follow a very similar theme, whereas I go through the area that is changing, give you the facts, and then kind of give you my views. I will just caveat it that it's my view. It has gone through our internal sources, but it is my view, which you can agree or disagree with. I hope you do agree with, but this kind of gives you an overarching, what impact will it have on me as an employer and the learners that I have internally. What I've also tried to do is identify where in the full sets of funding rules you will find these changes, so that if you do want to read them yourselves, you can quickly go to the relevant section. So this is all around learner eligibility. So this is clarifying that to be able to access the apprenticeship funding, providers must ensure that the individual is spending at least 50% of their working hours in England over the full duration of the apprenticeship. And the added in element is that it has to apply to remote and hybrid workers as well. So this is identifying and this is adapting that many people are now hybrid workers or working from home, but there is a fundamental rule that to be able to draw down apprenticeship funding, whether that be levy funding or the government part of apprenticeship funding, you must spend 50% of your time in England. So again, it's a rule that's always been in place. The remote and hybrid worker element has only really had to come in over the last few years, especially after COVID, but it does provide more clarity and hopefully ensure clearer planning. So if you do have learners, and there are often learners that may be dual site, or they go off and do certain maybe block learning in different parts of the country, that is absolutely fine. That has to be laid out very clearly in the training plan if they are leaving their main identified work site, which is the kind of registered site. But there needs to be that check that at least 50% of the time is obviously in England and in an English postcode. Okay, learning support. So this is probably the biggest, I would say one of the biggest changes. I think it's a positive change, and this is all around the Learner Support Fund. So LSF, as it is, there's so many acronyms, but the Learning Support Fund is a fund that is available to support the costs, and this is a provider pot of money that they can claim. If they are asked or if it is identified that reasonable adjustments or additional support needs to be put in place for a learner to successfully progress through their apprenticeship programme. There is guidance within the Equality Act, but there is also guidance within ESFA and DFE, so Department of Education and the funding agency, around what potential reasonable adjustments should be in. And this, like I say, is a pot of money that the providers can access. And what ESFA has said is that as part of the initial assessment, so that is the first set of tests that learners do when they're enrolling on a programme, is there must be a screening exercise done up front to identify whether any learning support may be needed. Now, this might just be a light touch, couple of questions, or it might be a more in-depth online test, or it might be a meeting that the apprentice has with somebody from the learning support team at the provider or at the college. But it's to show that there's an initial conversation happening about it. And I think the reason why that happens is sometimes reasonable adjustments and any learning support needs, learning difficulties aren't identified sometimes until it's too late. And I think what ESFA want, which is a good thing, is that upfront conversation happening to identify where there might be some areas that the learner needs some more support, so that that support can be put in place quickly, and it can be put in place at the beginning of the programme. So it means that everybody has that starting point that they need, and that they can move into their learning period without any barriers, or with limited barriers to stop them achieving. If from the identification from the screening, you can then, the learner and the provider can then request that a more detailed assessment can happen, and that can happen at any time during the programme. So it might be identified through the screening exercise that nothing's needed straight away, or that somebody might be on the cusp of needing something and it's agreed to kind of watch this space. And they're saying that that's okay too, at a later date, a more detailed assessment. So you might have a scenario where somebody maybe feels like they need some more, like, extra time on an exam, but until they start to look at registering and preparing for the exams, they might not agree to go through the formal assessments to apply for additional time, until closer to the time. But it's something that's identified and almost a watch this space and a monitor. In terms of claiming funding, providers can claim month by month, and in the past they've had to document month on month the support that they're providing. And what they're saying now is that that can be done every 3 months, and that aligns, and can align with progress reviews. So for those that haven't got a lot of experience with apprenticeships, every 12 weeks, maximum 3 months, a progress review must be carried out. And what ESFA are saying is that the 3 month reviews for learning support could be aligned with the progress reviews. And what it's saying, and what it's helping providers with, is the time pressures that it takes. So normally there's a form to fill in, you have to keep that updated. Good providers will carry on doing that because they'll want to have a record of any additional support, any additional activities, any extra sessions that their tutors are putting on for any learners. But relaxing it a little bit in terms of not having a mandatory month by month, record of that, it does allow some flexibility, to move that to 3 months, and hopefully will support providers with their administration, as there is a lot of administration when it comes to running a training provider. They are saying that claims can't be backdated and the claims must be submitted promptly. So that means that you can't, as a provider, offer the support and then claim it 6 months later. The providers need to make sure that they're staying robustly on top of the claims that they're putting through. But what it does mean is that it gives people a little bit of flexibility to be able to deliver the extra support, make sure it's having the impact that it needs to, and then they can put the claims through. In terms of your point of view from employers' perspectives, having your blessing and having your authorization on additional support that your apprentices needs, for me, is fundamental. Making sure that you're staying engaged in conversations that providers are having with your learners, and that you know what is going on. That might be authorizing that they have maybe a one-to-one session every month that's on top of their normal timetable, or providing the individual with printed textbooks, or bigger printed documents when they're doing pieces of work. And these might be something that you can also then introduce into their day-to-day tasks when they're with you at work, or you having some more in-depth understanding of where they might need additional support. So I would encourage you to stay engaged. I would obviously encourage you to make sure that you're supporting what the provider is telling you, and also stay engaged in terms of filling in those review documents, to show where that additional support is having an impact. You've also got every right to challenge if you don't think that support is being put in place when you might think it needs to. You will see the learners an awful lot more than the training providers will. If you're identifying areas that you think your apprentices might need some additional support, please don't stay quiet. Please raise it with your providers. Obviously open and transparent with the individuals that you're working with. But if you can work with the providers to identify where additional support might be needed, that might really help the learner, who might be sitting there struggling in silence, and might not know that a little tweak here and there to the support that they get might make all the difference. Moving on to English and Maths. So English and Maths, as I hope you all know, is a mandatory part of apprenticeships. Again, can sometimes be a contentious area, can be a barrier to people achieving their apprenticeships. But at the moment, and that doesn't look like it's changing anytime soon, English and Maths are a key requirement to as part of an apprenticeship programme. There has been some confirmation. I understand that this slide is quite wordy, so I'll try and summarise it by um, the confirmation that grades D to G or 3 to 1 in the new way that GCSEs are graded is the equivalent to a level one qualification, and that this means that if people have a 3, a 2, or a 1, or a D and G, D to G, that they do have the equivalency of a level 1. So if they're starting a level 2 apprenticeship and they have those grades, they do not have to fulfill any additional level 1 qualifications, and that applies to new apprentices but also retrospectively. So if you do have learners on level 2, if you want them to carry on doing some new learning, please be encouraged to raise that to your providers. But that has been clarified and is being kind of backdated through live apprentices that are on programme. Learners who have the level 1 equivalent, so if you do have a D to G, 3, 2, or a 1, learners will still be expected to work towards a level 2 qualification. And those undertaking a level 1 will have to do their level 1 and still work towards a level 2. And this is showing that people are what we call stretch and challenging, so that through the apprenticeship programme, if you have a learner that needs to do their level 1s, that they timely achieve that qualification and that they show progress towards a higher level. They don't have to fully pass all elements, but they have to show that they've worked towards and that there's meaningful evidence. And again, this meaningful is a little bit contentious as to what that evidence would be. But a training provider would be expected to show that a learner has done some additional work on top of their level 1 to achieve their level 2. Same as if somebody already has their level 1, over a period of 12 to 18 months, a good provider should be able to support them to fulfill their level 2 functional skills. And again, all evidence needs to be submitted as to where that has been done. If somebody has gone in for a test and they failed it, what additional support has been put in place to ensure that the learners had every opportunity to increase their English and maths knowledge. Where a learner has learning difficulties, so I said before that functional skills can be a barrier to achieving, and there is a long argument around whether English and maths should be mandated, how more contextualised English and maths could be used for certain subjects. What the ESFA have recognised is where somebody does have a difficulty and there is a barrier to overall achievement because of the English and maths, there could be flexibility in allowing the individual to just to work towards and achieve their entry level 3 functional skills. So in order of functional skills, you have functional skill entry level 1, entry level 2, entry level 3, and then level 1 and level 2. So there is an opportunity. This will be tightly monitored on a case-by-case basis. And if you're thinking about it in terms of your learners on programme, if you do have learners that are not able to pass their level 1 despite trying, it would be worth having a conversation with your providers around whether the evidence could be gathered and the case could be made that they could go through to gateway and endpoint assessment with their functional skills entry level 3. What they're talking about in respect of the evidence that will need to be forward is a self declaration isn't enough anymore. You can't just say, I've tried, I've done it, and I'm not passing. You need to be able to show, and there needs to be evidence gathered of the learner journey and what they've been through, what work they've tried to do, whether they have any formal evidence of as example, dyslexia, that they have a certificate, screening certificate of evidence for, and that they need to build a case. In previous years, that's all had to be done in the first 8 weeks of the programme, which has been quite a frantic and quite, especially when you're dealing with cohorts, it's been quite a lot to manage. That rule has now been removed, so it can be at any point in the apprenticeship programme. Again, I think this is all really positive. I equally know that some employers will want to see that their learners are being given every opportunity and every support planning, that can be put in place to make sure that the learners do achieve their functional skill. But put yourself into a learner's shoes sometimes, that to achieve their entry level 3 might be the greatest achievement that they have made, because it's something that they've always maybe struggled with. So being able to have this as a kind of last resort, but also on a case by case basis, this might be the difference of some individuals actually being able to achieve their apprenticeship with this flexibility put in place. I have marked in yellow that there is still some areas of ambiguity in what evidence an endpoint assessment organisation would need to allow Gateway to continue, because obviously an endpoint assessment plan has a Gateway requirement, which will have a level 1 or level 2 attached to it. What I am advising you all to do is to work with your training providers and work with your endpoint assessment organisations to identify what evidence they are going to need if you need to kind of evoke this rule, and ask them. A couple of EPAOs that I've spoke to have said that they will need a statement that is signed by all parties, but that isn't kind of the rule or the written rule, so it will depend on what individual organisations require. Again, speak to your providers, engage with your training providers and with your endpoint assessment organisations on this. But again, this is showing that there are some flexibilities when learners do really need it. In terms of off-the-job training and the training plan, another important move, especially, and I think this is quite applicable actually to quite a few of the programmes that either we support with, or I know that key science and technology companies do have apprentices on, is block or front-loaded programs. So an example where you might have learners that spend a year in college before they come to you, or learners that go off for kind of blocks of teaching and then come back to you. And what they're saying is the active learning period, which at the moment has been on a monthly basis, if at the beginning of the apprenticeship the delivery model is front loaded or block release, there won't be the mandated nature of needing to track active learning every month. So in the past, over the past couple of years, you've needed to be able to evidence month on month where some formal learning has taken place. What they're saying now is when the training plan is put together, if it's clearly identified where there are big blocks of learning, from an auditing point of view, it will then be understandable if there is some months where there isn't formal learning in, because they've already done, say, a month or 6 weeks. But what they're saying is that needs to be clearly identified, and you would hope that through timetables and through the kind of schedule and the training plan and your training contracts, that you'll be able to then show where there might be some kind of gaps in learning, or there might not be as much learning. For a normal programme where there is expected to be ongoing assessment and in ongoing sessions, you will still be required. And I've kind of put it into capital letters and things. This isn't a way of anybody trying to get away with having empty blocks and empty months. But for those front-loaded or block release models, it allows a bit of understanding that if you're spending a full year in college for a year, you might then just need some time in the first kind of quarter of the second year where you spend a lot of time in, with your employer, and then you might then go back to college kind of after Christmas and, start some level 3 units or start some higher level units. So it's understanding that content can be delivered in a variety of way. Again, I think this makes sense. I think providers have tried to explain this in the past, and it's probably been asked for because auditors have wanted some clarification on what ticks a box and what doesn't. But also, hopefully, with all of this coming into place, it will hopefully reduce the amount of paperwork that needs to be filled in, because what they're asking for is within the training plan that there is a description of what that model will be, and how that will then be, where the peaks of learning and then where potentially any lulls of acting learning might be in. So fingers crossed it will save you some paperwork and some signatures as well, but it won't affect, and it shouldn't affect any programs that learners are on now, and it is a new rule that's come in for this year, so anything retrospectively will apply to the previous year's funding rules. In terms of progress reviews, so hopefully and hopefully those that have spoken to me about progress reviews, you all know how important I believe progress reviews are. They remain the key opportunity for all three parties to come together once a quarter, reflect on what has been in the past, look at where we are now, and then plan for the future. And I always say to employers, the least that somebody within your business can give is some time with your apprentice and with your training provider once a quarter to just sit down, hopefully reflect positively on how the quarter has gone, but also set some targets and see what progress that learner is making. In terms of what's changed, they've now tried to clarify the language in terms of calendar months rather than kind of months. Again, it might feel quite self-explanatory, but it's just a clarification, because where there has been anomalies, there is always a bit of wiggle room. So the example that I've given is, if a progress review takes place on the 1st of August, the next review must take place on or just before the 1st of November. If learning support is being claimed, then the two discussions can be combined, which we spoke about earlier. And the change that's come in this year, which I don't really like, if I'm totally honest, is they are removing the mandatory need for an employer signature. I think they're doing this to ease some admin burden and to take some pressure off providers that continuously chase employers. And I'm saying that from somebody that used to be responsible for auditing progress reviews, and there was a lot of examples where employers hadn't filled it in. But I would still really encourage and would really say, and I'm sure you've all heard it for years now, that best practice models and the best way will be to remain engaged and attend and sign the form afterwards. It isn't nowadays a paper, well, in a lot of circumstances it isn't a paper-based form. It might be you have to go onto the system and tick a box to show your signature, but again, it's something that to stay actively involved with. But from a provider point of view, it gives a little bit of breathing space that they're not going to get into trouble at an audit if they don't have a signature anymore. Some final sections just to run through quickly, as I'm conscious of time, is there are funding for full funding available for 16 to 21 and apprentices aged 22 to 24 that may have had an educational healthcare plan. This will be fully funded to the maximum funding band, and that came out earlier on in the year, as well as the removal of the 5% co-investment and the increase in the levy, which I mentioned earlier on. So positive moves, that there is some more flexibility and some more funding available through the central apprenticeship pot. In terms of breaking learnings, this is around the active learning and within these 3 months rules. So the new rule will be that if a delivery model has a front loaded or a block release model and there is going to be a break, the learner and the provider must complete the form and put the learner on a break in learning. So this is when a learner might need to take some time away from the programme, and that means that their funding is paused until they're ready to return. if that falls into a learning period where they might fall behind, it's always better to put somebody on a break in learning. The reason why is any time that they're off the programme will then be added to the end without them losing any of their funding. It also means that you stop paying funding when they're not actually learning, and the provider stops to receive funding that they really shouldn't be receiving. So again, it's really important that a planned breaking learning is used if there isn't going to be any learning taking place. And again, it's a practical element to make it a little bit easier for providers to keep their audit requirements up to date. And then finally, just a summary on minimum duration and employment hours. So there is a bit of a terminology change around part-time apprentices and them working towards their planned hours versus their actual hours. And what this means is every apprenticeship has a minimum off-the-job requirement. Part-time learners will have to normally extend the length of their programme because they're not in as many hours. So it will take them longer to do their training hours. But what ESFA are saying is if they actually meet all the hours in a shorter time period, they could go through Gateway. They would still have to meet the minimum 12-month requirement, but you might be able to demonstrate that they've actually worked overtime for the majority of their apprenticeship, and therefore they've been able to move through the learning quicker, and they don't have to stay on programme for the extended time as it might have been set out. Eligible costs. So there's a new rule around that non-mandatory qualifications are not funded. To be honest with you, they haven't been funded for a while, but it is a clarification. Training providers have normally insisted that resits are paid for, but this has now been clarified. Backfill, again, clarification. I haven't been able to get anybody through a backfill claim for a long time, but this is now an ineligible cost, so wages cannot be used. And also any overseas qualifications that might be assessed are also ineligible. And then the final thing around endpoint assessment is making sure that this independence, where there is an integrated degree programme, the endpoint assessment must remain impartial. So for degree apprentices, such as on the new scientist degree apprenticeship, your providers will need to demonstrate that there is clear differences in the delivery team and the endpoint assessment team where that programme is integrated. That isn't something necessarily for you to worry about because it's an off-qual requirement that they must show that they are making sure that independence is remained. But ESFA have obviously felt that they need to clarify it, so it has been included where in this set of funding rules. And I think that brings us to the end. Yes, it does. So just in case you don't know who we are, so again, Rachel Roby from Cogent Skills. If you do want any more information, either from me on anything policy, technical education, etc., funding rules, please feel free to drop me a note. If you want to know any more about Cogent and what we do in terms of our consultancy services, so I offer apprenticeship consultancy services and our wider membership offers, please get in touch with Kat, who will be happy to answer any questions. And just before I finish, I'm just going to plug another session that I have planned, which is taking place in early October, which is all around endpoint assessment. So this is something that's been raised by our members, and it's hopefully a practical toolkit for what is endpoint assessment, what are the stages, what do we go through, and some really practical tips that have actually been gathered from apprentices, which is really good. So don't take my word for it, take theirs, on what would really help them and what would have really helped them if they'd had that in place when they were going through endpoint assessment. So hopefully it's a practical kind of session toolkit on all you need to know around endpoint assessment. I'll put the registration link in the chat in a second, but you can also find the details on our social media pages, my page as well. And I know that Cogent will be in touch with all our registered members in terms of plugging this and trying to get as many registrations as possible. So that's being held on the Tuesday, the 8th of October. So that's it from me. I can just see there's a couple of things in the chat. 1st of August. All of that, all yeah. So it would need. Oh, let me clarify. There's a message around the dates around when progress reviews will needed. I'm happy to take that offline and clarify that, but I still believe it is a full 3 month kind of 90-day window. But leave that with me, and I'll have a look at it. And if it is different than what I've put on the slide, I will come out and clarify. Is there anything else in the Q&A or in the... I can't see any. The only thing that I've been asked separately is whether we will be putting any more sessions on. What I can tell you is as soon as we know anything more around any policy updates or anything that's happening in terms of consultations, then yes, we will work out the best way to communicate with our audiences. Now, whether or not you have had this through the trade association membership, or whether you're a SIP member or part of the nuclear groups, we will comms out the best way that we can communicate any updates. It might be a round table, it could be an information sharing session like this, or it might be a workshop where we seek views of our supporting industries, but we will ensure that we keep you fully informed of all the activity that happens through this first Parliament year, and where we think and where there is some important news, Skills England, IFATE, any DFE consultations, we'll keep you in the loop. And thank you very much for joining.